I can't believe that bloody Richard is coming over here again. I don't want that nut in my house. He's madder than crazy Joe Davola. The last time he was here, he gave me this awful look. It wasn't the stink eye or the crook eye. Evil eye. In fact, I've looked into his eyes. He's pure evil. Hush, here he comes. Yamahama. Do you know that in 25 years of coaching, this is the first time that anyone's ever brought a severed head to their coaching session? That looks like Lord Hastings. Why don't you put it down over there? Look, Richard, whenever I agree to coach someone, it's because I believe in them. But whenever I'm away from you, you do some pretty reprehensible things. For example, you sent assassins to kill your brother George, you had your nephews murdered, and you proposed to Lady Anne during her father-in-law's funeral, whom you stabbed to death in the Tower of London. How do I know what you're going to do next? Frankly, I don't even know why you're here. Maybe you're trying to use me. Perhaps you think that by using your eloquent manipulation skills, you can confuse me. But don't take me for a fool. I'm not down with the things you've done. You should also know that some of my neighbors have seen you come to my house are very wary of you. My alibi is telling people I don't care for you, and that really is the truth. Maybe I'm just having you hanging around because I believe that Richmond will finally give you what you deserve. You know, it's a pity, but I can't seem to find someone who's as greatly despised by the people who know them as you, including your own mother. But fortunately, I do believe that the War of the Roses is finally drawing to an end. How can I be sure in a world that's constantly changing? Let's just call it a hunch. But the real question is, since you've beheaded so many of your so-called friends, how can I be sure where I stand with you? And I really, really, really want to know. See what I mean? I told you he's bloodthirsty.
What did you say?
I said, these pretzels are making me thirsty. In Andrew Lloyd Webber's 1979 Broadway musical Evita, we watch as a young woman with no connections, no political status, and no funding rises to become the First Lady of Argentina and nearly run the country. She does so by using her power of persuasion and an overriding sense of ambition. In William Shakespeare's Richard III, we watch as a deformed, limping hunchback overcomes numerous physical and political obstacles to become the King of England by using his incredible powers of persuasion and Machiavellian-like ambition. So let's take a look at the plot. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and the youngest brother of King Edward IV of England, opens the play by describing Edward's return to the throne after the Battle of Tewkesbury, saying one of the most famous opening lines in any Shakespeare play, "Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York." And even though the characters are entering into a new era of peace and joy, Richard describes himself as an ugly and unloved hunchback who must therefore accept himself for what he is, a villain. Richard uses soliloquies to allow us to learn what he's up to. He says that because of a prophecy which Richard made up, that G of Edward's heirs the murderer shall be, Edward's brother Clarence, whose given name is George, is placed under arrest. Edward interpreted the prophecy as referring to George, but for some reason never considers that it could have also referred to Richard of Gloucester. Richard speaks with Clarence as he's taken up to the Tower of London, saying he blames Edward's wife, Queen Elizabeth, and he pretends that he will try to help Clarence. Richard describes another plot to the audience in which he will attempt to marry Lady Anne despite being responsible for the death of her father-in-law and her husband. Anne attends the funeral of her father-in-law, the late King Henry VI. When Richard appears, Anne berates him, and then they see that Henry's wounds start to bleed afresh. Richard confesses to murdering the king, but says that Anne's beauty motivated it, and she spits in his face. Richard proclaims his feelings for her and offers his sword for her to kill him, but Anne says that she cannot be his executioner. He then offers to kill himself, but she instead reluctantly accepts his ring and marriage proposal, and he promises to repent for the murder. Richard marvels at having won her over so easily and tells the audience that he will discard her after she served his purpose. Meanwhile, the atmosphere at Edward's court is tense and filled with animosity. The established nobles are at odds with the ambitious relatives of Elizabeth, many of which are fueled by Richard's plots. Queen Margaret, Henry VI's widow, enters even though she was banished to France and warns the squabbling nobles about Richard and curses him extensively. The Yorkists all unite against her and ignore her warnings. Angered, Margaret hurls blood-curdling curses at virtually every one of them and departs. Richard sends 2 murderers to assassinate Clarence. When they arrive at the tower with the warrant, the assassins ponder how to carry out the deed, but Clarence awakes and pleads for his life, asking them to go to his brother Richard, who will reward them better for having kept him alive. One of the murderers tells Clarence that Richard hates him and was actually the one who sent them to murder him. After that, they stab Clarence and drown him in a butt of Malmsey wine. At the urging of the king, all the nobles promise to put an end to their mutual hate in front of Edward, and Elizabeth asks him to pardon his brother Clarence. But just then, Richard says that Clarence is dead on the king's own orders. Edward, who is ill and very near death himself, is very upset by this news, believing that his order of execution had been countermanded, and Richard openly blames those attending Edward. Edward dies soon after, and Richard becomes the Lord Protector. He then has several prominent officials in Edward's court imprisoned and eventually executed, most notably the Queen's relatives. Richard then persuades the dead king's 2 young sons, one of whom is the uncrowned Edward V, to stay at the Tower of London and await the coronation. Richard presents himself as the true heir to the throne and puts on a show depicting himself as a humble and deeply religious man with no pretensions to political ambition. He is greatly assisted by his cousin Buckingham. Hastings, also known as Edward's Lord Chamberlain, is loyal to Edward's children and objects to Richard's ascension. He is arrested and beheaded on a trumped-up charge of treason. At Richard's direction, Buckingham spreads a rumor that Edward's 2 sons are illegitimate and therefore do not have rightful claims to the English throne. The mayor of London and other lords are duped into accepting Richard as king, even though Edward's 2 sons are alive and in the Tower of London. Richard wants Buckingham's support in assassinating the 2 princes, but Buckingham is hesitant, which really upsets Richard. He therefore recruits an assassin named James Tyrrell to murder both children. After Richard denies Buckingham a previously promised land grant, Buckingham realizes that he'd better get away from Richard, and he defects to the side of Henry VI's nephew, the Earl of Richmond, who is currently living in exile. Richard strategically decides that he should wed his niece Elizabeth of York and Edward IV's next remaining heir. Richard announces Lady Anne's death, which was most likely at his hands, in order to more freely woo Elizabeth. Meanwhile, Richard's mother, the Duchess of York, and Edward's widow, Elizabeth, mourn the death of the princes. As prophesied, Queen Elizabeth asks Queen Margaret to help her curse Richard. Later, the Duchess also curses Richard, her only surviving son. Richard then asks Queen Elizabeth to help him win her daughter Elizabeth's hand in marriage, but the quondam queen is not taken in by his eloquence, and she stalls by saying that she'll let him know her daughter's answer in due course. Meanwhile, Richard is growing increasingly paranoid and loses what popularity he once had. He faces rebellions led first by Buckingham and followed by Richmond's invading forces. Unfortunately, Buckingham is captured and executed on All Souls' Day. Both sides arrive for a final battle at Bosworth Field, prior to which Richard, while asleep, is visited by the ghosts of his victims, each of whom tells him to despair and die. They also pray for and urge Richmond's victory. Richard wakes screaming for Jesus, but soon realizes that he's all alone and cannot even pity himself. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, Richmond's stepfather, Lord Stanley, and his followers defect from Richard, and Richard orders Stanley's young son George to be executed. However, there's no time to do so. The battle is at hand, and despite the fact that Richard has a larger army, his side falters. Richard is unhorsed on the field and cries out the most famous line in the entire play, a horse, my kingdom for a horse." The play concludes after Richmond kills Richard and claims the throne, becoming Henry VII, and performing this magnificent speech. "England hath long been mad and scarred herself. The brother blindly shed the brother's blood. The father rashly slaughtered his own son. The son compelled being butchered to the sire. All this divided York and Lancaster, divided in their dire division. Oh, now let Richmond and Elizabeth, the true succeeders of each royal house, by God's fair ordinance conjoin together, and let their heirs, God, if thy will be so, enrich the time to come with smooth-faced peace, with smiling plenty, and fair, prosperous days. Abate the edge of traitors, gracious Lord, that would reduce these bloody days again, and make poor England weep in streams of blood. Let them not live to taste this land's increase, that would with treason wound this fair land's peace. Now civil wounds are stopped, peace lives again, that she may long live here. God say, Amen. When we return, we'll look at some of the remarkable characters in Richard III. When it comes to Shakespeare's comedies, As You Like It is my favorite play. In fact, it's my favorite of all Shakespeare's plays. When it comes to tragedies, Macbeth is my favorite. However, when it comes to the history plays, Richard III is by far my favorite. In fact, I can't think of another literary villain that I enjoy seeing more than Richard III because he's just such a fascinating character. He seems to have much stacked against him because he's misshapen, hunchbacked, and by his own admission not very physically attractive. Yet it doesn't prevent him from climbing over multiple layers of nobility, including his older brother and the former King of England, and becoming king himself against all odds. And were that not enough, he also gets Lady Anne, whose husband he killed, and whose father-in-law, the late Henry VI, he also killed, to accept his marriage proposal at the funeral of the late king. The Duke of Buckingham is Richard's cousin and most loyal follower. He starts out so beloved of Richard that he calls him my other self, my counsel's consistory, my oracle, my prophet, and my dear cousin. He's willing to do virtually anything to help Richard ascend to the throne, but he hesitates when Richard wants his support in killing his two young nephews, and that hesitation costs Buckingham his life. When the play opens, Richard's brother, Edward IV, is the King of England and is married to Queen Elizabeth. He's not seen very much in this play, and his health is rapidly declining, leaving the Queen, her relatives, and their children vulnerable to Richard's ambitious pursuit of the throne. And although Queen Elizabeth suffers many losses in the play, in the end, she possesses the intellect to outsmart Richard and secures the marriage of her daughter Elizabeth to the Earl of Richmond, who eventually defeats Richard in battle and becomes Henry VII. Even though Clarence is Richard's older brother and next in line to the throne, he's assassinated before the end of Act I. Lady Anne is the widow of Henry VI's son Edward. Richard only marries her for political expediency, but doesn't intend to keep her long. I also want to mention Sir Richard Ratcliffe, who's charged with carrying out all of Richard's executions. He comes across as an amoral character, completing his tasks as nonchalantly as if he were delivering mail. However, he's always on his guard to make sure he doesn't do anything that would turn Richard against him. The Duchess of York is Richard's mother. However, even she is disgusted with him for being so bloody. She curses him and wishes him defeat at the hands of Richmond. And finally, we have one of Shakespeare's most transformative characters of all time, Queen Margaret, who was married to the late Henry VI. But far from the innocent 15-year-old virgin we first saw in Henry VI Part 1, and almost unrecognizable as the Lancastrian military leader in Henry VI Part 3, she's now grown into a living, breathing, and quite terrifying walking reminder of oral history, who longs for revenge from her enemies and spews forth the most blood-curdling curses and prophecies imaginable. Listen to what she says to the Duchess of York and Queen Elizabeth in Act 4, Scene 4, after the two princes have been slain. Thou hast a Clarence too, and Richard killed him. Then forth the kennel of thy womb hath crept a hellhound that doth hunt us all to death. That dog that had his teeth before his eyes to worry lambs and lap their gentle blood, that excellent grand tyrant of the earth, that reigns in gulled eyes of weeping souls, that foul defacer of God's handiwork, thy womb let loose to chase us to our graves. O upright, just, and true disposing God, how do I thank thee that this carnal cur preys on the issue of his mother's body and makes her pew-fellow with others' moan. The Duchess says, O Harry's wife, triumph not in my woes. God witness with me, I have wept for thine. And Margaret continues, Bear with me. I am hungry for revenge, and now I cloy me with beholding it. Thy Edward, he is dead that killed my Edward. Thy other Edward, dead to quit my Edward. Young York, he is but boot, because both they match not the high perfection of my loss. Thy Clarence, he is dead that stabbed my Edward, and the beholders of this frantic play, the unadulterate Hastings, Rivers, Vaughan, Grey, untimely smothered in their dusky graves. Richard yet lives, hell's black intelligencer, only reserved their factor to buy souls and send them thither. But at hand ensues his piteous and unpitied end. Earth gapes, hell burns, fiends roar, saints pray to have him suddenly conveyed from hence. Cancel his bond of life, dear God, I pray, that I may live to say, the dog is dead. When we return, we'll look at some of the plot devices and memorable scenes in Richard III. There are many supernatural elements contained in Richard III, including dreams, prophecies, curses, and ghosts. The first dream is Clarence's in the tower the night before he's assassinated, in which he thinks he's drowned and gone to hell. Then we see the dueling dreams of Richard and Richmond the night before they're to face each other in battle. Richard is visited by the ghosts of many of his slaughtered victims, who repeatedly tell him to despair and die. Richmond, on the other hand, is visited by the same ghosts who urge him on to success and victory. As far as memorable scenes go, it would be a lot easier just to say which ones aren't memorable. I've only found one. In Act 2, Scene 3, where 3 citizens react to the news of Edward IV's death and what that might mean for England in the future. Other than that, even the smallest scenes contain valuable information. For example, what initially looks like a throwaway scene in Act 3, Scene 6, which is only 14 lines long, a scrivener explains how he spent 11 hours preparing an indictment for Lord Hastings, even though Hastings was a free man 5 hours earlier. This short little passage demonstrates the corruption that is so blatant and yet how terrified people are to speak up against it, knowing of Richard's penchant for chopping people's heads off. In addition, in Act 1, Scene 2, Richard's ability to disrupt a funeral procession and get the grieving Lady Anne to agree to marry him is a thing of theatrical beauty. Even Richard is shocked by his ability to win her over so effectively. The scene of Clarence's murder in Act 1, Scene 4 is also quite unforgettable, as he wakes up from a terrible nightmare about drowning and going to hell, only to find two reluctant assassins waiting to kill him, and he winds up stabbed to death and thrown into a barrel of wine. There's also the incredible scene where Richard needs to dispatch Lord Hastings after learning that he's not willing to support Richard as king. This is in Act 3, Scene 4, and ironically, Hastings says, "There's never a man in Christendom can lesser hide his love or hate than he," meaning Richard, at line 52, and by line 77, Richard calls Hastings a traitor, insists on him being beheaded, and that it be done before his dinner time. Say what you want about Richard III, but one thing you have to give him, he certainly wasn't a procrastinator. When we return, we'll look at some of the major themes in Richard III. Let's face it, you can't have a serious discussion about Richard III without talking about ambition. It's Richard's ambition that drives him to overcome his physical, political, and succession obstacles and get to the throne. One would almost think that he co-wrote Machiavelli's leadership instructional guide, The Prince, because he uses its lessons so thoroughly. But that's not Richard's only tool in his skill set. He understands how power works as well, especially as an intimidation tool. Richard demonstrates great influence over Prince Edward, the heir apparent, by convincing him and his younger brother to go to the Tower in order to keep them safe. Richmond also demonstrates his power and influence with the rebel forces, and considering that he may not even have a legitimate claim to the crown, he has enough personal magnetism and credibility to get people to follow him, especially those from the anyone but Richard crowd. On the other hand, Clarence has no power and insufficient influence to persuade the two hesitant murderers from going through with his assassination. And ironically, King Edward IV seems virtually powerless due to his weak and sickly health and his inability to get his nobles who are loyal to him to sincerely warm up to the Queen's relatives whom he questionably elevated into the nobility. In fact, his inability to even countermand his own order to have his brother Clarence killed throws him into a tailspin. Here he is in Act 2, Scene 1, incidentally, the only scene in which he appears, disgusted by a request by Lord Stanley to get a pardon for his servant when no one came to Clarence's rescue when he needed it. King Edward says, "Have I a tongue to doom my brother's death, and shall the tongue give pardon to a slave? My brother killed no man. His fault was thought, and yet his punishment was bitter death. Who sued to me for him? Who in my wrath kneeled at my feet and bade me be advised? Who spoke of brotherhood? Who spoke of love? Who told me how the poor soul did forsake the mighty work and did fight for me? Who told me in the field at Tewkesbury, when Oxford had me down, he rescued me and said, 'Dear brother, live and be a king'? Who told me, when we both lay in the field, frozen almost to death, how he did lap me, even in his garments, and did give himself all thin and naked to the numb cold night? All this from my remembrance brutish wrath sinfully plucked, and not a man of you had so much grace to put it in my mind. But when your carters or your waiting vassals have done a drunken slaughter, and the precious image of our dear Redeemer, you straight are on your knees for pardon, pardon. And I, unjustly too, must grant it you. Before my brother not a man would speak, nor I, ungracious, speak unto myself for him, poor soul. The proudest of you all have been beholding to him in his life. Yet none of you would once beg for his life. O God, I fear thy justice will take hold on me, and you, and mine and yours for this. And who could ever forget Richard's masterful demonstration of persuasion and his incredible performance at Henry VI's funeral procession, in which a grieving widow goes from spitting in his face, cursing her late husband's murderer, and calling him hated wretch, foul devil, dreadful minister of hell, a lump of foul deformity, diffused infection of a man, devilish slave, hedgehog, homicide, foul toad, and a dissembler who's unfit for any place but hell, and then agreeing to marry him in the span of a mere 212 lines. And of course, Richard staged multiple rejections of the crown in front of the mayor of London and the aldermen is priceless. Not only does he get the crown he's been seeking, but he talks the crowd into insisting that he accept it against his will. When it comes to Shakespearean manipulators, Richard III even outshines Iago. I'm sure even P.T. Barnum would be proud. Tyranny is also rampant in Richard III. First, we see it in Richard's intimidation tactics with the guards at Henry VI's funeral procession. Then, towards the end of the play, we see him coerce Lord Stanley by threatening to chop his son's head off if he doesn't do as he's told. With Richard, you're either with him or you're against him. Lord Hastings found that out the hard way. So did the Duke of Buckingham, who was willing to help his cousin get the throne, but drew the line at killing children in order to do so, and it cost him his head. Ironically, though, Richard worked at least as hard to keep his crown once he got it as he did in trying to get it in the first place. In Act 5, Scene 4, the ghost of Richard's victims come to him in a dream, and 11 different times tell him specifically to despair and die. Those words would have had a very clear meaning to an Elizabethan audience. Despite his many faults, Richard was Catholic, and if you're Catholic, then you know if you despair, you're committing an unforgivable sin because it means that you've lost all hope and you don't trust in God's wisdom. This is very significant because if you despair and die, your soul is going to hell. In other words, it's not enough to these murdered victims that Richard die. They want him to die and to spend all eternity in hell. This is the worst curse you could ever bestow on anyone. If you remember in Hamlet, Hamlet holds off slaying Claudius while he's at prayer because he doesn't want Claudius's soul to go to heaven. Even Clarence's murderers tell him to prepare his soul so that when they kill him, his soul won't go to hell. As bloody a monster as Richard was, at least he didn't want Clarence's soul to be damned for all eternity. When we return, we'll look at some of the most powerful lines in Richard III. Question: how could someone who is such an evil villain be such an interesting and popular character? I think the answer is that he tells us what he's going to do, he takes great joy in doing it, and he's unapologetic about his actions. It's fascinating that he will tell us the truth and yet lie to virtually everyone he encounters on the stage. And let's face it, if he wasn't so arrogant, charming, and masterful in his persuasion, he wouldn't be any fun for us to watch or actors to play. He sets the tone from his very first soliloquy, which opens the play. Indeed, he is the only king in any Shakespeare play who starts it off with a soliloquy. And what a soliloquy it is. Pay attention as it moves into 3 different parts. In part 1, Richard updates us on the fact that his brother Edward is now the king and that sensual festivities have replaced battles. Part 2 shows Richard starting to feel sorry for himself, saying that his appearance is not really appealing to women, and so he's content to be a villain. And in part 3, he lays out his calculating strategic plan for getting everyone out of the way in order for him to become the King of England. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York. And all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean Buried. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, our stern alarums changed to merry meetings, our dreadful marches to delightful measures. Grim-visaged war hath smoothed his wrinkled front, and now, instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking-glass, I, that am rudely stamped, and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nymph, I, that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. Why, I, in this weak, piping time of peace, have no delight to pass away the time unless to see my shadow in the sun and descant on my own deformity. And therefore, since I cannot prove a lover to entertain these fair well-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days. Plots have I laid, inductions dangerous, by drunken prophecies, libels, and dreams, to set my brother Clarence and the king in deadly hate the one against the other, and if King Edward be as true and just as I am subtle, false, and treacherous, this day should Clarence closely be mewed up about a prophecy which says that G of Edward's heirs the murderer shall be. After pouring on the sympathy for his brother, Richard shows us his true colors as Clarence is carted off to the Tower. This is also in Act 1, Scene 1. Richard says, out of earshot, "Go tread the path that thou shalt ne'er return. Simple plain Clarence, I do love thee so, that I will shortly send thy soul to heaven, if heaven will take the present at our hands." Right after that, Richard encounters the newly released Lord Hastings and learns from him that Richard's brother, King Edward IV, is sickly and believed to be near death. Once Hastings leaves, Richard once again shares his thoughts with us, saying, he cannot live, I hope, and must not die till George be packed with post-horse up to heaven. I'll in to urge his hatred more to Clarence with lies well steeled with weighty arguments, and if I fail not in my deep intent, Clarence hath not another day to live, which done, God take King Edward to his mercy, and leave the world for me to bustle in. For then I'll marry Warwick's youngest daughter. What, though I killed her husband and her father? The readiest way to make the wench amends is to become her husband and her father. The which will I, not all so much for love, as for another secret close intent, by marrying her, which I must reach unto. But yet I run before my horse to market. Clarence still breathes, Edward still lives and reigns. When they are gone, then must I count my gains. As we move into Act 1, Scene 2, Richard puts on one of the most incredible performances of his life by winning over the hand of Lady Anne, widow of Edward, Prince of Wales, after Richard killed both him and his father, Henry VI, at the funeral procession. Even Richard himself is shocked by his success and says, "Was ever woman in this humor wooed? Was ever woman in this humor won? I'll have her, but I will not keep her long. What? I that killed her husband and his father to take her in her heart's extremest hate, with curses in her mouth, tears in her eyes, the bleeding witness of my hatred by, having God, her conscience, and these bars against me, and I no friends to back my suit at all, but the plain devil and dissembling looks? And yet to win her, all the world to nothing. Ha! Has she forgot already that brave Prince Edward, her lord, whom I some 3 months since stabbed in my angry mood at Tewkesbury? A sweeter and a lovelier gentleman, framed in the prodigality of nature, young, valiant, wise, and no doubt royal, the spacious world cannot again afford. And will she yet abase her eyes on me, that cropped the golden prime of the sweet prince, and made her widow to a woeful bed? On me, whose all not equals Edward's moiety? On me that halts and am misshapen thus? My dukedom to a beggarly denier, I do mistake my person all this while. Upon my life, she finds, although I cannot, myself to be a marvelous proper man. I'll be at charges for a looking-glass and entertain a score or two of tailors to study fashions to adorn my body. Since I am crept in favor with myself, I will maintain it with some little cost. But first I'll turn yon fellow in his grave, and then return lamenting to my love. Shine out, fair sun, till I have bought a glass, that I may see my shadow as I pass. And lastly, let's look at Richard bragging about his ruthless treachery as he gives us a status update in Act 4, Scene 3, saying, "The son of Clarence have I pent up close, his daughter meanly have I matched in marriage. The sons of Edward sleep in Abraham's bosom, and Anne my wife hath bid this world good night. Now, for I know the Briton Richmond aims at young Elizabeth, my brother's daughter, and by that knot looks proudly on the crown. To her go I, a jolly thriving wooer." Shameless, diabolical, and methodical. There's no question why actors including Sir Laurence Olivier, Christopher Plummer, George C. Scott, Ian Holm, Robert Lindsay, Edward Woodward, Robert Downey Jr., Kenneth Branagh, Mark Rylance, and Denzel Washington have all included this role in their repertoire. When we return, we'll look at some of the major turning points in Richard III, as well as some of the correlations to the other Shakespeare plays. All right, now let's look at three key turning points in this play. First, we have Act 2, Scene 2, when we hear what we have suspected all along. Edward IV is dead. As a result of this news, Richard is now protector of the realm and in perfect position to dispatch his two nephews and set his sights on the throne. He also has Rivers, Vaughan, and Grey executed to destroy the Queen's support base. Next we have Act 4, Scene 5, when Richard approaches the widowed Queen Elizabeth and asks for her help to persuade her daughter Elizabeth to marry him. We know that Richard is only doing this to prevent Richmond from marrying her and creating a greater claim to the throne. However, Elizabeth is much too clever to be taken in by Richard's persuasions. Unlike Lady Anne, whom Richard preyed upon while she was vulnerable, consumed with grief, and completely confounded by his overtures of love during a funeral procession, Queen Elizabeth sees him for what he is, a cold-hearted, calculating Machiavel, and she placates him until she can get word to Richmond that her daughter will marry him instead. And finally, we have the climax of the play in Act 5, Scenes 4 and 5, when Richmond slays Richard and vows to unite the houses of York and Lancaster to create the beginning of the Tudor dynasty, thus ending the War of the Roses. Now, let's compare some of the correlations in Richard III to Shakespeare's other plays. In Act 1, Scene 2, we see the slain King Henry VI's corpse bleed afresh at his funeral, a totally supernatural event. In Henry VI, Part 3, the three sons of York view three sons all combining into one, another totally supernatural event. In Act 3, Scene 7, Richard is offered the crown 3 times and refuses it before finally agreeing to be king. In Julius Caesar, Mark Antony offers Julius Caesar the crown 3 times, and each time he turns it down. However, we know that he decides to go to the Senate the next day after Metellus Cimber tells Caesar that they expect him to be offered the crown again. In both cases, the denials were done for show and to test their popularity. In Act 4, Scene 4, the Duchess of York, Queen Elizabeth, and the former Queen Margaret all take to their knees and moan their sorrows and plot their curses against Richard. In Coriolanus, Volumnia, Virgilia, and Valeria all kneel down and successfully entreat Coriolanus not to destroy Rome. At the beginning of the Two Noble Kinsmen, the 3 distressed queens kneel down and successfully entreat Duke Theseus to help them get the bones of their fallen husbands off the battlefield. Unlike the assassins Thaliard and Leonine in Pericles, Prince of Tyre, Hubert in The Life and Death of King John, Pisanio in Cymbeline, and Camillo in The Winter's Tale, who don't actually kill anybody, the first 2 unnamed murderers do kill Clarence, and Dighton and Forrest do kill the two princes in the tower. We also saw Banquo, Lady Macduff, and her son get slaughtered by assassins in Macbeth. In Act 4, Scene 2, Richard says, "I am in so far in blood that sin will pluck on sin." In Act 3, Scene 4 of Macbeth, Macbeth says, "I am in blood stepped in so far that should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as going o'er." Also, in Act 5, Scene 5, Richard is visited by the ghosts of numerous people he's slain, who not only tell him to despair and die, but also tell his opponent Richmond to be joyful and triumphant. In Julius Caesar, Marcus Brutus is visited by the ghost of Julius Caesar the night before his battle and eventual death. And finally, in Act 5, Scene 7, Richard says that he thinks there are 6 Richmonds in the field, 5 of them he'd already killed. This was a military strategy that armies used to confuse their enemies. They would dress up multiple people as the king. We saw this in Henry IV, Part 1, and in Julius Caesar, Lucilius pretends to be Marcus Brutus when he's captured. There are also 3 correlations to the Holy Bible, all in Act 1, Scene 4, and have to do with the death of Clarence. First, after Brackenbury reads the murderer's commission, he says, "I will not reason what is meant hereby, because I will be guiltless of the meaning." Next, immediately after Clarence's assassination, the second murderer says, "How fain, like Pilate, would I wash my hands of this most grievous, guilty murder done." St. Matthew chapter 27, verse 24 reads, "And Pilate, seeing that he prevailed nothing, but rather a tumult was made, taking water, washed his hands before the people, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just man." And finally, the second murderer even repents afterward and tells the first murderer to keep the fee, almost like Judas Iscariot trying to give back the 30 pieces of silver after betraying Christ. When we return, we'll look at some interesting facts about Richard III. In preparing to do this episode, I did some research, and this is what I found. Richard III was written either in late 1592 or early 1593. It's Shakespeare's second longest play after Hamlet. Shakespeare used Sir Thomas More's History of Richard III, which he found in the Chronicle histories by Edward Hall and Raphael Holinshed, to create his play. Shakespeare also incorporated lessons from Niccolo Machiavelli's cynical rulebook for leaders entitled The Prince, which was published in 1513, and made them the basis for Richard's strategic and calculated political ambitions. Ironically, as bloody as the play is, except for Clarence being stabbed in Act 1, Scene 4, there is no onstage violence in the play until Richard's death in the final battle scene. As with several other history plays, Shakespeare conflated and altered much of the reality about these characters in order to make the play more interesting and unforgettable. For example, Queen Margaret went back to France in 1476 and died before Richard became king 7 years later in 1483. Edward had Clarence killed not because of Richard, who was loyal to the king, but because he was found guilty of high treason in 1478, although it's unlikely Edward would have done it without Richard's support. However, out of courtesy to his mother, Edward allowed Clarence to choose his method of execution, which was to hang upside down and be lowered into a barrel until he drowned. By the way, Malmsey wine is also known as Madeira. Julius Caesar did not build the Tower of London, as Buckingham says. It was built originally in 1078 by William the Conqueror and was rebuilt in 1285. Richard was born on October 2nd, 1452, and was the 11th of 12 children. He was crowned on July 6, 1483, when he was only 30 years old, and reigned for less than 2 years until his death on August 22nd, 1485. Richard and Lady Anne Neville had known each other for many years before they wed, and even grew up under the same roof in Middleham Castle, which was Warwick's house from the time Richard was 8 years old. Richard was 20 years old when the couple married in 1472. Among their accomplishments, Richard ended local feuding in the north. They founded Cambridge University's King's College and Queen's College, gave generously to the church, and paid for masses to be said for the souls of fallen comrades before Anne died of consumption or tuberculosis in March of 1485. In Yorkshire, the names Richard and Anne still outnumber all other names in the church registers. Richard's symbol is the white boar and is referenced several times within the play. His personal motto translates as, "Loyalty binds me." The real Richard was a model brother to the king and a model uncle to his nephews. In fact, Shakespeare's portrayal of him has been so negatively distorted that he remains the only English monarch to have his own fan club known as the Richard III Society, whose goal is to restore the historically accurate, balanced, and fair account of this controversial king. The term the War of the Roses did not initiate until 1828, when it was coined by Sir Walter Scott. Rutland was actually one of Richard's elder brothers, and Richard was only 8 years old when Rutland was slain. The two young princes, Edward and Richard, grew up separately and were virtually strangers to one another. And even though Shakespeare has Richard exclaiming, a horse, my kingdom for a horse" at Bosworth Field, he was actually offered a horse but declined it. Oh well, as Mark Twain and others have said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. Catherine of Valois, the widow of Henry V, was the mother of Richmond, who became Henry VII. In 1961, John Steinbeck used the opening line from Richard III for the title of his final novel, The Winter of Our Discontent. In August 2012, Richard III's remains were discovered buried under a car park parking lot in Leicester. Upon examination, it was determined that he suffered from spinal scoliosis, causing a pronounced curvature of the spine, but there was no evidence of a deformity, a hunchback, a withered arm, or limp. There are many references in the play about Edward IV being a drunkard, a glutton, and a womanizer who had many mistresses before and during his marriage to Queen Elizabeth. Most notable among them, though, was Mistress Jane Shore, who is mentioned several times in Richard III. Edward IV was so taken by her that she was allowed to live in court, and he stayed with her until her death. And although she didn't seek any personal or political gain for herself, she was very influential in gaining pardons from the king for people who really needed them. But in addition to Edward IV, she also became the mistress of Sir Thomas Grey, Edward IV's stepson and Elizabeth Woodville's son from her first marriage, and Lord Hastings, who had been one of Edward's most trusted advisors. And finally, there's been a great deal written about the actual lives of Edward IV and Richmond Henry VII. In fact, there's much evidence, or at least conjecture, that Richmond was not legitimate and as a result would not have been in line to seek the crown. However, there is also significant records indicating that Edward IV might not have been the son of Richard, Duke of York. If that's the case, his claim would also be faulty. Unfortunately, because the records are so numerous and equally murky, it's difficult to say with total certainty if either of these two men should have been the legitimate inheritors of the English crown, and therefore all the conjecture about their legitimacy seems to have resulted in much ado about nothing. When we return, we'll look at some of the remarkable actors in the 1983 BBC Shakespeare version of Richard III. All right, now let's take a look at some of the truly remarkable actors in the 1983 BBC Shakespeare version of Richard III. The magnificent Ron Cook, who plays Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, and becomes Richard III, also played the third messenger and the Countess's porter in Henry VI Part 1, Richard Plantagenet in Henry VI Part 2, and returns as Richard, Duke of Gloucester in Henry VI Part 3, all in 1983. In addition, he also played Peter Simple in The Merry Wives of Windsor in 1982. Michael Byrne, who plays the Duke of Buckingham, also played the Duke of Alençon in Henry VI Part 1, and John Hune in Henry VI Part 2. the Marquis of Montesquieu in Henry VI Part 3, and Antonio in The Two Gentlemen of Verona, all in 1983. The talented Julia Foster, who plays Margaret, also played the same role in Henry VI Parts 1, 2, and 3, all in 1983. Rowena Cooper, who plays Queen Elizabeth, played Lady Elizabeth Grey in Henry VI Part 3, also in 1983. Brian Deacon, who plays Henry, Earl of Richmond, also played the Earl of Somerset in Henry VI Parts 1 and 2, and several roles including the Earl of Oxford in Henry VI Part 3, all in 1983. Brian Prothero, who plays King Edward IV, also played the Bastard of Orleans, there's something to brag about, in Henry VI Part 1, Edward Plantagenet in Henry VI Parts 1 and 2, and King Edward IV in Henry VI Part 3, all in 1983. He also played Saturninus in Titus Andronicus in 1985. Tennille Evans, who plays Lord Stanley, played the Duke of Bedford, Edmund Mortimer, and a French general in Henry VI Part 1, the Earl of Salisbury in Henry VI Part 2, and various roles in Henry VI Part 3, all in 1983. He also played Sir Hugh Evans in The Merry Wives of Windsor in 1982. Derek Farr, who plays Sir Robert Brackenbury and the Bishop of Ely, also played Sir William Lucy and the Earl of Salisbury in Henry VI Part 1, Lord Say in Henry VI Part 2, and the Duke of Exeter and the Mayor of York in Henry VI Part 3, all in 1983. Paul Chapman, who plays Lord Rivers, also played the Earl of Suffolk in Henry VI Parts 1 and 2, and Lord Rivers again in Henry VI Part 3, all in 1983. Derek Fuke, who plays the second murderer, and Sir Thomas Vaughan, played various roles in Henry VI Parts 1, 2, and 3, all in 1983. Anthony Brown, who plays Sir Richard Ratcliffe, also plays the Duke of Burgundy in Henry VI Part 1, Walter Whitmore and Alexander Iden in Henry VI Part 2, and Sir John Montgomery and Louis the King of France in Henry VI Part 3, all in 1983. Arthur Cox, who plays Lord Grey and the Lord Mayor of London, played the Mayor of London and Sir John Fastolf in Henry VI Part 1, Lord Clifford in Henry VI Part 2, and the Duke of Somerset in Henry VI Part 3, all in 1983. David Dacre, who plays Lord Hastings, played Renier, the Duke of Anjou, and Vernon in Henry VI Part 1, and the Duke of Buckingham in Henry VI Parts 2 and 3, all in 1983. Peter Wyatt, who plays the Duke of Norfolk, also played Woodville in Henry VI Part 1, Sir Humphrey Stafford in Henry VI Part 2, and the Duke of Norfolk again in Henry VI Part 3, all in 1983. Alex Gard, who plays various characters including the Marquis of Dorset, also played young John Talbot in Henry VI Part 1, the Second Prentice in Henry VI Part 2, and various characters including the Marquis of Dorset again in Henry VI Part 3, all in 1983. David Burke, who plays Sir William Catesby, also played the Duke of Gloucester in Henry VI Parts 1 and 2, plus Dick the Butcher in Henry VI Part 2, all in 1983. He also played Camillo in The Winter's Tale in 1981. Angus McNamara, who plays Lord Lovell, also played various roles including young Clifford in Henry VI Parts 1, 2, and 3, all in 1983. The excellent actor Markween Davey, who plays Sir James Terrell, played the Earl of Warwick in Henry VI Parts 1, 2, and 3, all in 1983. Peter Benson, who plays King Henry VI, also played the same role in Henry VI Parts 1, 2, and 3, all in 1983. He also played the second gravedigger in Hamlet in 1980 and Clown's servant in The Winter's Tale in 1981. Annette Crosby, who plays the Duchess of York, also played Maria in Twelfth Night in 1980 and Dionysa of Tarsus and Pericles, Prince of Tyre in 1984. Bernard Hill, who plays the first murderer and Sir William Brandon, also played the Master Gunner and the Duke of York in Henry VI Parts 1 and 2, and returned as the Duke of York in Henry VI Part 3, all in 1983. In addition, he also played Captain Smith in the 1997 blockbuster film Titanic. Anne Carroll, who plays Mistress Shore, also played Eleanor, Duchess of Gloucester, in Henry VI Part 2 in 1983. Jeremy Dimmock, who plays the young Duke of York, also played Mamillius in The Winter's Tale in 1981. Rusty Livingstone, who plays the page to Richard III, also plays Prince Henry in The Life and Death of King John in 1984. Peter Alwyn, who plays the Second Company, reprises the role in Henry VI Parts 1, 2, and 3, all in 1983, and played a British captain in Cymbeline in 1982. And finally, once again, Paul Jesson, who plays George, Duke of Clarence, Plantagenet, also played Clown in The Winter's Tale in 1981, Cloten in Cymbeline in 1982, multiple roles including the second messenger to the king and the Duke of Clarence in Henry VI Parts 1, 2, and 3, all in 1983, by the way, the first citizen in Coriolanus in 1984, and Costard in Love's Labour's Lost in 1985. That means that he has appeared in 8 different BBC Shakespeare plays, more than any other actor in the entire series. Congratulations, Paul. Now, stay tuned for today's trivia challenge, which is called The Song Remains the Same. All right, now it's time for today's trivia challenge called The Song Remains the Same. Shakespeare used songs in several of his plays, but in some cases he used lyrics from the same song in more than one play. Name which pair of plays the following lyrics appear in. Number 1, Willow, Willow, Willow. Number 2, With Hey, Ho, the Wind and the Rain. And number 3, Hey, Nonny, Nonny. When we return, I'll have the answers for you, and we'll wrap up with some relevant lessons from Richard III. Okay, now let's see how you did in today's trivia challenge called The Song Remains the Same. Shakespeare used songs in several of his plays, but in some cases he used lyrics from the same songs in more than one play. You are to name which pair of plays the following lyrics appear in. Number 1, Willow, Willow, Willow. That would be The Two Noble Kinsmen and Othello. Number 2, With Hey, Ho, the Wind and the Rain. That would be Twelfth Night and King Lear. And number 3, Hey, Nonny, Nonny. That would be Much Ado About Nothing and The Two Noble Kinsmen. Now let's finish up with some relevant lessons from Richard III. Number 1, remember, fame is fleeting and success doesn't last. For all of the Machiavellian scheming Richard planned, his entire reign as king lasted less than 2 years. Second, remember that, as Lord Acton famously said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Richard had no business being king. Thus his actions and ambitions clearly showed through during his ascent to the throne and led to his eventual downfall. And finally, as Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, for everything you gain, you lose something. While it's true that Richard did become king for a little while, it cost him his reputation, his friends, and even his life. When you decide what course you want to take, be sure to weigh the pros and cons and make sure that if you get it, you still feel it was worth the struggle. I'm Dave Romeo, and thank you for watching this episode of Romeo and Shakespeare. Please join me next time when the sight of a beautiful princess turns best friends into foes and 2 royal cousins start trading blows.